He kept a single chair in his office that no one else was allowed to sit in. Not clients, not other partners, not even his own assistant when she came in to drop off the mail. It sat across from his desk, angled slightly toward the window, and for 6 years it was, unofficially, mine. Nobody ever told the other women in that office not to sit in it. They just noticed, eventually, that they weren't supposed to, the way you notice a fence before anyone tells you where the property line actually runs. He never once touched me. Not my hand, not my shoulder, not even the brief, accidental brush of 2 people passing in a narrow hallway. Every woman in that office, at some point over those 6 years, asked me directly what was between us. I never had a good answer, because the true one, nothing, and also everything, never fit in a sentence short enough for a hallway conversation. I should start with how it began, because the order matters and because I've never told this whole thing straight through to anyone, start to finish, and I find I owe it to both of us to finally get it right. My name is Eleanor Voigt. I was 29 when I started at Barrett, Klein & Associates, a corporate law firm in Minneapolis on the 11th floor of a glass building downtown, with a lobby fountain that made a sound I could still recreate from memory if you asked me to. I'd come from a smaller firm, one that hadn't survived the recession particularly well, and I took the offer at Barrett Klein because it was, plainly, the best one on the table, not because of anything or anyone I knew there. I want to say that clearly, early, I was good at my job before any of this began, and I stayed good at it the whole way through. Nothing about what follows was ever a substitute for that. He was 49 when I met him. Marcus Reyes, senior partner, head of the litigation group, the kind of name junior associates said with a specific hush in the elevator. He'd sat in on my final interview almost as an afterthought. I found out later he rarely did that for lateral hires, and asked me one question none of the 4 other partners in the room had thought to ask. What's the case you lost that you still think about? I told him about a settlement I'd pushed a client toward too early, out of my own inexperience, that I still believed, 2 years later, could have gone differently at trial. He nodded once, wrote something down, and didn't say another word for the rest of the interview. I got the offer that same week. I found out much later that his one note, the only one he'd written that whole hour, was simply, "She still carries it." Good. He was married. 18 years, to a woman named Josephine, whom I met perhaps a dozen times over the years, always at firm functions, always warm in a way that never once felt performed. I want to name that plainly here, at the start, the way I'd want it named if someone else were telling this story about me, because everything that follows only makes sense with that fact sitting in full view the entire time. Never hidden, never minimized, never the thing the audience discovers halfway through as some kind of twist. The routine that came to matter most started without either of us deciding it would. 3 weeks into the job, buried in an unfamiliar case file at 8 at night, I knocked on his half-open door to ask a procedural question I was embarrassed to still not know the answer to. He waved me into the chair, the one that would, over the following 6 years, become mine without either of us ever saying so out loud, and spent 40 minutes walking me through not just the answer, but the whole shape of the reasoning behind it. That became a pattern, not scheduled, never once put on a calendar, but real. Most Tuesday and Thursday evenings, after the floor thinned out, I'd end up in that chair, and we'd talk through whatever case was eating at me that week, until the cleaning crew's cart started rattling down the hallway outside. He had a habit, during those evenings, of loosening his tie exactly 1 notch, never removing it, never further than 1 notch, the moment the conversation moved from strictly professional into something more like actual thinking out loud. I noticed it the first month. I didn't understand, for years, that I'd started watching for that one small motion the way you watch for a curtain rising, because it meant the real conversation, the honest one, was about to start. The second motif was smaller, and took longer to notice. He kept a chess set on the credenza behind his desk, mid-game, that never seemed to move, until, one evening in my second year, I mentioned offhand that I used to play with my grandfather, and the next time I came in for one of our Tuesday sessions, the board had advanced one move. I made my own move without comment. He made his the following week. That game went on, one slow move at a time, for the next 4 years, and neither of us ever spoke about it directly. It became its own kind of conversation, running quietly underneath all the others. The third thing I noticed slowest of all, in 6 years, he never once asked me a question about my personal life that I hadn't opened the door to myself. Never asked if I was seeing anyone. Never asked why I sometimes came in on Mondays looking like the weekend had cost me more than it should have. He waited, always, for me to bring a door to him before he'd consider stepping through it. I understand now that this wasn't distance. It was the opposite of distance, wearing very careful clothes. I need to say plainly what the gap between us actually was, because it's the entire architecture of this, and I've heard enough people since then try to flatten stories like mine into something simpler and cheaper than they were. He was the head of litigation, not my direct supervisor on the org chart. My reporting line ran through a different partner, but everyone on that floor understood that his opinion of an associate's work was, in practice, worth more than most direct supervisors combined. I was 29, then 32, then 35. He was a married man 20 years my senior, with 2 children in college, and 18 years of a life that had nothing to do with the 11th floor. Neither of us ever pretended that gap wasn't there. We built whatever this was in the narrow space directly beside it, and in 6 years, neither of us ever once leaned on it. Somewhere around my second year, I started noticing the smaller things accumulating into a shape I didn't yet have a name for. The way he'd glance up when I walked past his open door, even mid-sentence with someone else, for less than a second, and then continue without missing a beat, as though the glance had cost him nothing. Though I'd come to understand, it cost him something small and deliberate every single time. The way he restructured his own calendar, more than once, so a Tuesday session never got bumped by a client call, even when letting it slide would have been the easier, more defensible choice for a man that senior. The way that once, finishing a closing argument together at nearly midnight, the 2 of us alone with the document on the shared screen, he stood close enough that neither of us moved for several seconds longer than the screen required, and neither of us spoke of it after. Renata, a fellow associate 2 offices down, asked me directly once, in the elevator, the 2 of us riding down together after a long Thursday. "You and Reyes," she said, not unkindly, more curious than accusing. "Everyone wonders. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm saying there's clearly something there, and nobody can name it." I gave her the answer I'd apparently rehearsed, without ever consciously writing it. He's a good mentor. I got lucky landing in his group. She looked at me a beat too long. The doors opened, and she let it go, the way people do when they've decided the question isn't worth spending the friendship on. I've thought about that elevator ride more than almost anything else from those years, how I handed her something true and something false in the very same breath, and didn't even notice myself doing it until hours later. She wasn't the only one who asked, over the years. I want to be honest about that, because the title of this isn't an exaggeration for effect, it's simply what happened. Priya in the corporate group asked me once at a holiday party, more bluntly, 2 drinks in, "Is there something going on with you and Marcus?" Genuinely asking, not gossiping. I deflected that one too, some version of the same rehearsed line, slightly recalibrated for her directness. Camille, a paralegal who'd worked under him for a decade, asked me in her own way, not with words exactly, but with a long, appraising look the first time she saw the chess set had moved, like she was doing arithmetic she'd rather not finish out loud. Even Josephine, his wife, asked me once, gently, at a summer associate dinner, in a tone that wasn't suspicious so much as genuinely curious, "Marcus talks about your cases more than he talks about most people's. What is it about you two?" I told her something about shared instincts in the courtroom, and she nodded, and I've never been sure, to this day, whether she believed the answer or simply decided, out of some grace I didn't deserve, to let me keep it. The most direct question anyone ever asked me came from Camille, the paralegal who'd worked under Marcus for a decade before I ever arrived, and who noticed things the rest of the floor was too busy to notice. It was late on a Friday, the two of us alone finishing an exhibit binder, when she set down her stapler and looked at me in a way that told me she'd been deciding whether to say something for longer than that particular evening. "I've watched 5 associates come through this group in 10 years, she said. None of them ever sat in that chair. Not once. He'd pull a second one in from the hallway before he'd let anyone else use his. She wasn't accusing me of anything. Her voice was almost gentle, the way you'd tell someone something they probably already knew but hadn't yet said aloud to another person. I'm not asking you to explain it. I just want you to know that I see it, and I've never once thought less of either of you for it. Whatever it is." I didn't have a rehearsed answer ready for her, the way I did for Renata or Priya. Something about the plainness of what she'd said made the usual deflection feel dishonest in a way it hadn't with the others. "I don't fully know what it is either," I told her, which was the truest thing I'd said to anyone about it in 3 years. "I know it's never been what people assume when they ask." "I know that too," Camille said. "That's exactly why I've never said anything to anyone else." She went back to the exhibit binder, and neither of us ever raised it again, but I understood, walking out that night, that I'd been given something rare. A witness who'd decided, on her own, that some things are better protected by silence than exposed by concern, however well-intentioned. There was another moment, months later, that I think belongs beside that one. A junior partner named Whitfield, new to the litigation group, sat down in the chair one afternoon while Marcus was on a call, waiting to ask him something about a filing deadline. I walked in a few minutes later, saw Whitfield sitting there, and felt something close to physical discomfort before I'd even registered why. Marcus finished his call, saw the two of us, and there was a half-second, brief, almost nothing, the kind of thing only someone who'd spent 3 years reading his half-seconds would have caught, where his eyes went to the chair, then to Whitfield, then back to his desk, and something in his jaw set very slightly before he said, perfectly evenly, "Whitfield, let's take this in the conference room. I need the whiteboard anyway." It wasn't dramatic. Nobody watching would have thought anything of it. But I understood, standing in the doorway, that he had just quietly, wordlessly, without ever naming what he was doing, protected the one piece of furniture in that office that had become, over years, a language between us neither of us had ever agreed to speak aloud. Here is what I privately believed, during that long stretch of years, though I want to be honest that I was never certain of any of it, not close to certain, and I think he'd say the same if he were the one narrating this instead of me. I believed he had built, somewhere private in himself, a version of caring about me that he had decided, deliberately, would never be permitted to become anything else. Not repression. I don't think it was repression, exactly. I think he'd looked at it clearly, the way he looked at every brief that crossed his desk, and made a decision, and then quietly remade that same decision, evening after evening, for 6 years, without ever needing my help to make it. I believed the Tuesday and Thursday sessions were, for him, a controlled, rationed amount of something he would otherwise have had to give up completely. And I believed, this is the part I was least sure of, that some portion of what he felt toward me wasn't really about me specifically at all, but about some earlier version of his own ambition. Before the partnership and the mortgage and the 2 decades, that he got to visit for 90 minutes, twice a week, without ever having to explain the visit to anyone, including, perhaps, himself. I could be wrong about every part of that. I want to say so plainly, because I never once asked him outright, and he never once told me outright, and everything I've described is a story I built to live inside a silence I couldn't interrogate without risking the loss of the very thing I was trying to understand. The obstacle was never a mystery, and I don't want to make it sound like one, because that would dress this up as more complicated than it deserves to be. The obstacle was Josephine, and 18 years, and 2 children he clearly adored discussing in the specific, unguarded way parents do when they've stopped performing pride and are simply reporting facts. He never once complained about his marriage to me, not once. In 6 years did he say a single disloyal word about her. If anything, he mentioned her more than the conversation strictly required, which I came to understand, over time, as its own kind of fence, built and deliberately maintained, evening after evening, brick by small brick. There was one night, in my 3rd year, when the fence was tested without either of us choosing it. We'd stayed past 11 preparing for a trial neither of us could quite let go of. The office empty except for the hum of the shvac and the distant sound of the cleaning crew 2 floors down. And when we finally looked up from the table, the windows had gone fully dark. The city's lights spread out below us in the particular way that makes a room feel smaller and larger at the same time. We stood at the window for a while afterward, not talking, watching the traffic thin out on the street 11 floors down. He was close enough that closing the distance would have taken less than a second, and I understood, with a stillness I still remember with total clarity, that he knew that too, and that we were both choosing, in real time, breath by breath, not to. Neither of us said a single word about it afterward. We gathered our things when the moment passed, and he held the door, and that was that. I didn't understand, standing there that night, what any of it would eventually cost either of us, or what it would eventually reveal. I only understood that something had been offered and declined by both of us at once, without a word passing between us. And that this exact, quiet, mutual refusal was somehow the realest thing that had ever happened between 2 people I'd been part of. There's a second obstacle-tested scene I haven't told you yet. One I've circled longer than any other memory from those years, because it's the one that still makes something in my chest tighten when I let myself think about it fully. It was a deposition trip to Chicago, just the 2 of us representing the firm. An overnight stay that neither of us had engineered, and both of us, I think, quietly noticed the shape of once the travel arrangements came through. We finished later than expected, missed the last direct flight home, and ended up with adjoining rooms at a hotel near the courthouse. A detail neither of us commented on when we checked in, but that both of us clearly registered. Because I remember the specific silence that followed when the front desk clerk handed us keys with sequential room numbers. Unable to sleep, somewhere near midnight, I heard him in the hallway and opened my door before I'd fully decided to. He was standing near the ice machine, tie loosened exactly 1 notch, looking like a man who also hadn't managed to sleep. "Can't sleep either," I said. Not really a question. "Not particularly," he admitted. We stood there for a moment under the fluorescent hallway light, the ice machine humming between us, neither of us moving toward the other, neither of us retreating. "I keep going over the Hartwell Cross," he said finally, which was true, and which both of us understood was also, somehow, not remotely what either of us had actually been lying awake thinking about. I don't think I've got the sequencing right yet. I've been turning over the same thing, I said, which was also true, and also not the whole truth. We talked through the cross-examination for perhaps 15 minutes, standing in that corridor, and then he said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and we each returned to our own room, and I lay awake afterward listening for any sound through the wall. And heard nothing, and understood the nothing as its own kind of answer, that whatever might have happened in a version of that night with fewer scruples in either of us, wasn't going to happen in this one. Because neither of us was built, or willing to let ourselves be built, that particular way. I want to tell you honestly that I don't know, even now, whether he lay awake on his side of that wall the way I lay awake on mine. I never asked him. Some things, even in the telling of this, I still don't feel entitled to know with any certainty. Marcus retired the winter I turned 36, 6 years after I'd first walked into that 11th floor office. It wasn't sudden, very little about him ever was, but it still landed with a weight I hadn't properly measured until it actually arrived. He announced it at a partners meeting during a stretch when I was out on a deposition of my own, so I heard about it secondhand, from Renata, who found me in the hallway with an expression that told me she thought I'd want to sit down before she said anything further. He'd told people it was about wanting more time with his children before they were fully grown and gone. About Josephine's own father needing more looking after than the family had planned for. About 26 years being enough for one man to give one firm. Our Tuesday and Thursday evenings didn't stop right away. We had perhaps 4 more of them in that strange final stretch, each one a little more careful than the last, both of us aware of a clock neither of us mentioned aloud even once. On what turned out to be the final one, he didn't loosen his tie. I noticed, and said nothing. I think now he simply forgot, for once in 6 years, and I think the forgetting told me more than getting it exactly right ever could have, that the ritual had never really been about the tie at all. The chess game ended unfinished. He made what would be his last move on a Thursday I didn't yet know was the last Thursday, and I never got the chance to answer it before he was gone from the building entirely. I kept meaning to write the position down from memory before I forgot it. I never managed to. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me didn't want to finish it, because finishing it would have meant admitting the game itself was actually over, not merely paused. He gave me a card before his last day, his personal email written on the back in his precise litigator's hand, and said, "For when you argue something you actually believe in, and want a second set of eyes that isn't billing anyone by the hour." I kept that card in my wallet for the next several years, tucked behind my driver's license, in the place reserved for things I might need suddenly and couldn't afford to lose. I told myself, in the years that followed, a version of our history that I understand now was mostly a story I needed in order to keep functioning at that desk without those evenings. I told myself it had been mentorship, purely and only that, and that whatever I'd felt at the window that night, or in that hotel corridor in Chicago, was a younger associate's confusion about a tension, easily mistaken for something larger than it actually was. I told myself Renata's question in the elevator had been answered honestly. I told myself the chess set, the loosened tie, the chair no one else was allowed to sit in, all of it had simply been the ordinary texture of a good mentorship. Nothing more, nothing underneath worth excavating. I made partner myself, 3 years after he left, and I told myself I'd earned it entirely on my own merits, which was true, and also, I would come to learn, not the complete truth. There's one more thing from that in-between stretch I should tell you, because it still catches in my throat a little when I let myself return to it. The year after Marcus retired, I ran into Josephine alone, unexpectedly, at a downtown pharmacy on a Saturday afternoon. both of us reaching for the same aisle at the same moment. We talked for a few minutes, the ordinary catching up two people do when they've known each other peripherally for years. And near the end of the conversation, she said something that stayed with me far longer than the conversation itself warranted. "He still keeps that old chess set in his study," she said, not quite looking at me when she said it, examining a shelf of something neither of us needed. "Never plays it with anyone." I asked him once why he kept it out instead of packing it away like everything else from the office. He said he was in the middle of a game he hadn't finished. She looked at me then, briefly, something unreadable and not unkind in her expression. I didn't ask who with. I think I already knew, in the way you know things about your husband that he's never actually told you. I didn't know what to say to that, standing in a pharmacy aisle with a basket of ordinary Saturday errands in my hand. I said something small and inadequate about how he'd been a wonderful mentor, and she nodded and let me have the smallness of that answer, the way she seemed to have let both of us have quite a lot over the years, without ever once asking either of us to account for it out loud. I drove home afterward and sat in my car in my own driveway for several minutes longer than the drive should have required, turning that conversation over, understanding for the first time the full weight of what it must have cost a woman to watch something like this exist beside her marriage for 6 years, and choose, deliberately, generously, again and again, not to make it smaller or uglier than it actually was. The discovery happened almost 5 years after he retired, during a firm-wide digitization project that nobody particularly wanted, but everyone eventually had to sit through. Decades of paper files being scanned and shredded before the firm moved to a smaller, more modern floor 2 levels up. I'd volunteered, somewhat reluctantly, to help oversee the litigation group's archive, mostly because nobody else wanted the job, and I understood, even before I fully admitted it to myself, that I wanted to be the one going through those boxes, rather than leaving it to someone who wouldn't recognize what they were looking at. I found it in a file marked, in handwriting I recognized instantly, even after 5 years, with nothing more than a case number that didn't correspond to any client I remembered working on. Inside wasn't a case at all. It was a personnel matter, an internal memo, 6 years old, from the year I'd first started at the firm, regarding a partner track review committee's initial ranking of that year's lateral hires. My name was on the list, ranked 4th out of 5, based on a formula weighted heavily toward billable hours logged in the first 90 days, a number I'd been quietly behind on that year, because I'd spent an unusual amount of that early stretch untangling a mess left behind by the associate I was replacing, work that never got properly billed to anyone because the client relationship was already so strained. Attached to the memo, in Marcus's handwriting, was a formal objection, a full page, single-spaced, arguing the committee's formula didn't account for exactly the kind of invisible client-preserving work I'd done that quarter, and requesting the ranking be reconsidered. Beneath that, a second document, the committee's revised ranking, moving me from 4th to 1st, with a note indicating the change had been made, following what was described only as additional context provided by M. Reyes. I sat on the floor of that archive room for a long time, boxes open around me, understanding for the first time that the trajectory I'd always quietly credited to my own first quarter performance had actually been shaped, at its very foundation, by an objection he'd filed on my behalf that I'd never known existed, in a room I was never in, about a ranking I never even knew I'd received. I drove to see him 3 days later. He and Josephine had moved to a house on a lake about 90 minutes outside the city, the kind of place people retire to when they've spent 30 years in downtown conference rooms and finally want to hear something other than traffic. I hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years. He looked well. Retirement had settled into him more easily than I'd expected. Less weight in his face than I remembered from those final months at the firm, though something in his posture still carried the specific stillness I remembered from 6 years of watching him think before he spoke. Josephine answered the door, hugged me in a way that surprised me with its warmth, and said, "He still asks about your cases, you know, reads the legal news like he's still half-employed." She left us on the back porch with iced tea and the sound of the lake somewhere beyond the trees. I set the folder on the table between us without much preamble. "I found this in the archive. The digitization project." He looked at it for a long moment before touching it, and something moved across his face that I recognized instantly because I'd seen its close cousin exactly once before, at the window on the 11th floor, all those years ago. Not guilt, exactly, and not pride either. Something closer to a man watching a door open that he'd built specifically to stay shut, and discovering, now that it had opened anyway, that he wasn't as sorry about it as he might once have assumed he'd be. "I wondered if that would ever surface," he said. "You filed an objection. Got my ranking changed. First quarter of my first year, and I never knew any of it happened." "It was the right call on the merits," he said, which was true, and which we both understood was also not remotely the whole point. The formula was lazy. It didn't account for the kind of work that doesn't show up on a timesheet until months later, if ever. Any decent litigator on that committee should have caught it without my having to say anything. "But none of them did," I said. "You did. And then you never told me." He was quiet for a while, the kind of quiet I'd learned, over 6 years, not to fill. Finally he said, "I watched you those first 90 days doing exactly the kind of work that never gets rewarded and always gets punished by formulas built by people who've forgotten what the actual job requires. I filed the objection because it was correct, and I never told you, because telling you would have made it a favor you owed me. And I never wanted you to owe me anything. I wanted you to make partner on the strength of every year after that one, entirely on your own, without a single doubt about whether you'd earned it. If you'd known about the ranking, I think some small part of you would always have wondered how much of your career actually belonged to you. I didn't want you carrying that question for the rest of your practice." "You could have told me eventually," I said. "Once I'd already proven myself a dozen times over. Once there was no risk of it changing how I saw my own record." "Perhaps," he said. "I thought about it, more than once, over the years. I never found a moment that felt like the right one. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me also simply didn't want to spend whatever this was." He gestured, briefly, at the space between the 2 porch chairs, at 6 years compressed into a single motion, on something that sounded, however accurately, like a confession. It felt safer to let it stay exactly what it was. An unremarkable piece of paper in an unremarkable file, doing its quiet work without either of us ever having to discuss it. I thought, sitting there, of the chess game frozen mid-position, of the tie loosened 1 notch and 1 notch only, of the night at the window when neither of us moved and neither of us needed to say why. All of it sat differently now, recalibrated by a single objection memo filed in my first 90 days, at a firm I'd since made partner at, not changed in its facts, but changed entirely in its weight. "Did Josephine know?" I asked. "About any of it? The objection, the ranking, the reason you filed it?" "She knew I filed it," he said. "I never hid that from her. I've never hidden anything from her, in the sense that matters. I told her the week it happened. She asked me once, years later, why I'd never mentioned it to you directly, and I gave her almost the same answer I just gave you. She said something to me then that I've thought about often since. She said, 'You're allowed to have cared about training someone well, Marcus. It doesn't need to be a secret just because it was also more than that.' I've never quite known what to do with the also more than that part of that sentence. I don't think she meant anything scandalous by it. I think she meant something closer to what you and I actually had. A version of caring that was real and bounded and never asked either of us to be anything other than exactly what we were. I sat with that for a long while, watching the lake through the trees, understanding that the woman who had, for 18 years, been the entire reason this story could never become anything else, had also, in her own clear-eyed way, made room for it to be precisely what it was, without ever needing to shrink it into something smaller or uglier than the truth. I thought, too, of Camille, and told him about that Friday evening with the exhibit binder, the chair, her gentle refusal to ask for an explanation. The way she'd simply decided to see it and protect it rather than name it. She never told me she'd said that to you, Marcus said, something in his voice that might have been surprise, or might have been the particular quiet of a man learning, 11 years later, that he'd been more visible than he'd ever let himself believe. I always suspected she knew. I don't think I ever wanted to confirm it, because confirming it would have meant admitting how little of this was ever actually private, however careful we both were. Whitfield sat in the chair once, I told him. You moved the meeting to the conference room before I'd even said anything. He was quiet for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, surprised sound. The first real laugh I'd heard from him that entire visit. I remember that. I told myself it was about the whiteboard. He shook his head slightly. I don't think I let myself examine, at the time, what I was actually protecting. I think if you'd asked me, in that exact moment, I'd have denied there was anything to protect at all. It's strange, isn't it, how much easier it is to see the shape of a thing 11 years later than it ever was while you were standing directly inside it. I don't think it's strange, I said. I think that's just what restraint costs. You don't get to see the whole shape of it until you're finally allowed to stop holding it up. The chess game, I said eventually, because it felt like the smallest, safest thing to reach for, and because I genuinely wanted to know. You never finished your last move. Or, you did. I just never answered it. He almost smiled at that, the closest I'd seen him come to one since I'd arrived. I remember the position, he said. I could probably still set it up from memory if you wanted to finish it. I've thought about that unfinished game more than I probably should admit to a woman I filed a personnel objection for, and then never told about it for 11 years. I'd like that, I said. Finishing it, I mean. And I meant it plainly, without any of the weight the sentence might have carried in a different kind of story. Just two people closing a loop that had been open a long time, because closing it, at this point, cost neither of us anything real. We went inside, and he found the old travel chest set in a box in his study that Josephine, it turned out, had packed and unpacked twice across 2 moves without ever once suggesting he throw it away. And he set up the position exactly as he remembered it. And I sat across from him at his kitchen table, the way I'd sat across from him at that office desk for 6 years, and I made my move. It wasn't a particularly good one. I'd gotten rusty. Or perhaps I'd simply been playing a different, longer game with him for over a decade without fully realizing it, but it was mine. Finally answered, after 11 years of an open position sitting untouched in both our memories. I owe you something, I said, once the board was settled and neither of us had moved to clear it away. I don't fully know what. But something, for the ranking, for the objection, for 11 years of not knowing any of it happened. You don't, he said, the same plain certainty I remembered from every real conversation we'd ever had in that chair by his old office window. You built the entire rest of your career yourself, one case at a time, in full view, with nothing hidden about any of it. The objection got you a fair starting line. It didn't run a single mile of the race for you. I'd rather you understand that clearly than spend even one more year wondering how much of your own record was actually yours. I believed him. I think I'd believed some version of that all along, underneath the recalibration, that whatever the objection had done for me at the very start, everything after it, every closing argument, every case I'd won or lost on my own judgment, had genuinely belonged to no one but me. We didn't become anything, that afternoon or after. I want to be honest about that, because it remains the truest part of this whole account, the thing I most want you to understand if you take nothing else from it. There was no confession that reorganized either of our lives. No leaving of anyone, no beginning of anything new. He was a retired man with a wife inside the house, who'd made her own quiet, generous peace with exactly what this had always been. And I was a woman in her late 30s who had just learned the precise shape and cost of 6 years of careful, deliberate, entirely unspoken devotion. What we did, instead, was simpler, and I think, now, considerably harder one than anything more dramatic could ever have been. We sat at that kitchen table another hour, finishing a chess game 11 years overdue, talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. Exactly the way we always had. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to my car and reached past me, out of some old habit neither of us examined, to open the door before I could reach the handle myself. "Some things don't change," I said, half laughing, despite everything. "No," he said. "Some things you decide once, carefully, and then simply keep deciding, quietly, for as long as anyone asks it of you." I still have that email card in my wallet, worn soft at the corners now. I still think, sometimes, about every woman who ever asked me directly what was between Marcus and me, and about the answer I could never quite give any of them. Because the true one was never simple enough to survive a hallway conversation, it was something closer to. Nothing that anyone could name. And also, quietly, everything that actually mattered. I think restraint gets an unfair reputation. In a world that keeps insisting love only counts if it's spoken, chaste, resolved into something you can put a single word to at a wedding toast. But some of the truest care I have ever received came from a man who decided, over and over, for 6 years and 11 more after that, not to say it, and said it anyway, in an objection memo filed and never mentioned, in a tie loosened exactly 1 notch, in a chess game left open for over a decade, because neither of us could quite bring ourselves to call it finished. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.